The room wasn't a dojo, and it wasn't a movie set. It was a stripped-down military training hall, with scuffed floors, bare walls, and the kind of silence that only exists in places where people are taught how to survive. And standing inside that silence were U.S. Marines, not recruits fresh out of boot camp, but seasoned men with deployments behind them, men who had learned the hard way what works when adrenaline spikes and rules disappear. And into that space walked Bruce Lee, not wearing a uniform, not carrying rank, not projecting authority the way the Marines were used to recognizing it, but moving with a calm that immediately felt out of place, like water poured into a room made of stone. The session had been arranged as a demonstration, not a ceremony, and the Marines stood relaxed but alert, arms crossed, expressions neutral, because respect in that room was earned, not given. And Bruce understood that instinctively, which is why he didn't start by explaining philosophy or lineage or tradition. He started by observing, watching how they stood, how they shifted their weight, how their eyes tracked movement, because Bruce never taught in abstraction. He taught to the reality in front of him. The commander overseeing the session was a tall man with a clipped voice and a posture that had been drilled into him over decades, and he watched Bruce with polite skepticism, the kind that comes from experience rather than arrogance, because this commander had seen techniques fail under pressure, had seen beautifully executed moves collapse the moment chaos entered the equation. And when Bruce began talking about speed, interception, and economy of motion, the commander finally spoke, not disrespectfully but firmly. This won't work in real combat. And the words hung there, heavy, because no one in that room questioned what real combat meant. Bruce didn't react the way people expect someone to react when challenged by authority. He didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue definitions. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the statement as a valid concern, and said quietly, "Okay." And that response alone unsettled the room a little, because confidence without defensiveness is rare, especially in environments built on hierarchy. Bruce asked for one volunteer, not the smallest man, not the biggest, just someone willing, and a Marine stepped forward without hesitation, because Marines don't hesitate when asked to step into uncertainty. And Bruce positioned him at arm's length, explaining in simple terms what would happen. No tricks, no choreography, just an attempt to stop a straight attack. The Marine took his stance, solid, grounded, every muscle trained to explode on command, and Bruce stood opposite him, hands relaxed, posture loose, almost casual, and from the outside it looked unbalanced, like a mismatch in seriousness. But seriousness isn't measured by tension. And Bruce waited, letting the Marine settle, letting the room hold its breath without realizing it was doing so. The commander watched closely, arms still crossed, because he expected failure, not out of malice, but out of experience. And Bruce finally moved, not with a dramatic lunge, not with a telegraph strike, but with a sudden, direct motion that ended inches from the Marine's chest. And the Marine flinched late, his response arriving after the moment had already passed. Bruce stopped immediately, hand open, no aggression, and the Marine blinked, surprised, then reset, assuming the first exchange was simply unfamiliarity. And Bruce nodded again, inviting another attempt. And this time the Marine was ready. Eyes sharper, muscles primed, every instinct screaming awareness, and Bruce moved again. Just as fast, just as clean. And again the Marine reacted too late, his block slicing air where Bruce's hand had been a heartbeat earlier. A murmur rippled through the room, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle shift, because these were men trained to trust their reactions, and something had just bypassed that trust. The commander uncrossed his arms slightly, not consciously, just enough to signal interest replacing skepticism, and he said, "Again." And Bruce complied, not accelerating, not escalating, just repeating the same motion with the same precision, and the Marine missed again. And at that point the room went quiet in a different way. Not skeptical silence, but focused silence. The kind that appears when trained minds encounter something they can't immediately categorize. Bruce stepped back and addressed the group, his voice calm, almost conversational, explaining that the problem wasn't strength, wasn't courage, wasn't conditioning. It was timing, and more specifically, intention. That most combat training conditions soldiers to respond to visible threats, to cues, to movements that announce themselves, but real danger doesn't always announce itself cleanly. And speed that removes preparation, removes opportunity to react. The commander challenged him again, pushing back with the kind of practical reasoning only experience produces, pointing out that chaos, terrain, weapons, and fatigue change everything, and Bruce listened carefully, not interrupting, because he respected that reality. And then he asked for another Marine, this time one with combat experience. And the man stepped forward, expression serious now, not amused. This time, Bruce asked the Marine to attack him, not with the punch meant to land, but with intent. And the Marine obliged, stepping in aggressively, and Bruce moved in a way that defied expectation, not retreating, not meeting force with force, but intercepting, jamming the attack before it could develop, redirecting momentum, and it happened so fast that the Marine stumbled slightly. Not because he was weak, but because his structure had been disrupted at the source. Bruce released immediately, stepping back, hands open again, and the Marine stood there, breathing hard, eyes wide, because he felt what had happened in his body before he fully understood it in his mind. That was when the commander spoke again, but this time, his tone had changed. The skepticism softened into curiosity, and he asked how such techniques could be trained under stress, how they could survive the unpredictability of real engagements. And Bruce answered honestly, saying that no technique survives unchanged, but principles do, that interception, efficiency, and adaptability scale with chaos rather than collapse under it, and that the goal isn't to memorize movements, but to condition decision-making at speed. The Marines listened now, fully, because the room had felt the truth of what Bruce was saying, not as theory, but as sensation. The silence that followed wasn't imposed, it was earned, and it wasn't reverence, it was recalibration. The sound of trained systems adjusting to new information, and Bruce didn't push further, didn't try to dominate the session, because he understood that once the seed is planted, forcing growth only damages it. The commander nodded slowly, thoughtful, and dismissed the Marines, not abruptly, but with that controlled authority that signals reflection rather than dismissal. And as the room cleared, several Marines lingered, asking questions, testing movements, curious now in a way that hadn't been there before. That day didn't end with applause or declarations, but its impact didn't end there either, because the principles Bruce demonstrated aligned with problems military trainers were already wrestling with. How to prepare soldiers for encounters that unfold faster than conscious thought. How to reduce hesitation. How to act decisively without overcommitting. And over time, those ideas quietly influenced the evolution of modern close combat training. Not because Bruce Lee wore a uniform, but because reality doesn't care where good ideas come from. After the Marines were dismissed and the echo of boots faded down the corridor, the room stayed heavy with thought. The kind of weight that doesn't come from authority, but from recognition, because every man in that hall knew what he just felt wasn't theory dressed up as confidence. It was something closer to instinct refined, and the commander remained behind for a moment, standing near the edge of the mat, hands on his hips now instead of folded across his chest, posture loosened just enough to signal that the rigid lines of rank had given way to honest evaluation. He looked at Bruce for a long second before speaking again. Not as a superior addressing a guest, but as a professional addressing another professional. And he said, "Most demonstrations fall apart when adrenaline spikes." And Bruce nodded immediately, not defensive, not dismissive, because that was the heart of the problem. Bruce replied quietly that adrenaline doesn't destroy technique. It exposes unnecessary technique. That under stress, the body doesn't rise to the level of its training. It falls to the level of its simplicity. And that sentence alone reframed the entire conversation, because the Marines had been trained to simplify gear, simplify communication, simplify objectives. Yet many fighting systems still demanded complexity at the moment, when complexity fails fastest. The commander gestured toward the mat and asked Bruce to show them again, not faster, Not harder, but messier. Closer to the chaos of a real encounter. And Bruce agreed without hesitation, because chaos was never something he avoided. It was something he studied. Another Marine stepped forward, this time instructed not to cooperate at all, to move unpredictably, to crowd space, to apply pressure. And Bruce led him, allowing the Marine to close distance aggressively, arms pumping, shoulders tense, the way people move when intent overrides elegance. Bruce didn't try to dominate the exchange. He didn't seek a clean line. He simply let the Marine commit. And then he stepped just enough off center to steal balance, guiding momentum rather than stopping it, using the Marine's forward drive to create a moment of vulnerability that lasted less than a heartbeat. But that was all that was needed. Bruce disengaged immediately, hands open, leaving the Marine upright but unsettled, his center compromised, his forward certainty gone. What struck the commander wasn't that Bruce had won the exchange, but that he'd ended it without escalation, without lingering control, without the need to prove anything further. Because in real combat, staying entangled is often the most dangerous choice of all. Bruce explained that his goal was never to stay in the fight longer than necessary, that survival favors resolution, not domination, and that idea resonated deeply with men who had learned the hard way that prolonged engagements multiply risk. The commander asked about weapons, about whether these principles could apply when blades or rifles entered the equation. And Bruce didn't pretend otherwise. He acknowledged that weapons change everything, but not in the way most people assume, that distance, timing, and intent become even more critical, and that the same principles of interception and economy still apply, because the human body still has to decide before it acts, and reducing that decision time is universal. He spoke about adaptability, about not marrying technique to context so tightly that it breaks when the context shifts, and the Marines listened with the kind of attention that isn't taught, only earned. As the conversation continued, it became clear that what Bruce had offered wasn't a replacement for military training, but a refinement of it, a lens through which existing skills could become more efficient under pressure. And that distinction mattered, because no one in that room was interested in abandoning what they knew. They were interested in sharpening it. Bruce never positioned himself as an authority over them, only as someone who had spent his life studying how the body behaves when time collapses, and that humility kept the dialogue open rather than defensive. By the end of the session, the commander extended his hand, not ceremoniously, but firmly, and thanked Bruce, not for proving him wrong, but for showing him something useful. And Bruce returned the handshake with the same calm respect he'd carried into the room. The Marines who had initially stood with crossed arms now lingered with questions, wanting to test movements again, wanting to feel the timing for themselves, because once you feel that kind of efficiency, you can't unknow it. Bruce stayed, answering questions patiently, guiding adjustments, never rushing, never overstaying, understanding that learning under pressure requires space. In the months and years that followed, elements of what Bruce demonstrated began surfacing quietly in military and law enforcement training, not under his name, not as a branded system, but as principles absorbed into evolving doctrines of close combat, interception, and rapid decision-making. Because the best ideas in combat don't spread through credit, they spread through effectiveness. The Marines who were there that day carried the experience with them, not as a story to boast about, but as a reference point, something to measure future training against. What made that room fall silent wasn't that a civilian had outperformed soldiers. It was that someone outside their structure had articulated something they already sensed, but hadn't yet refined, that real combat punishes excess, that simplicity under speed is not weakness, and that adaptability beats memorization every time. Bruce didn't leave behind a manual or a syllabus. He left behind a question, and questions are far more dangerous than answers because they force growth. Years later, when people spoke about that session, they often exaggerated it, turning it into a dramatic confrontation or a cinematic display. But those who were actually there remembered something quieter and far more important, the moment skepticism gave way to understanding. The moment trained men recognized the truth not because it was asserted, but because it worked. And that's why the room went silent. Not in shock, not in defeat, but in respect. Because silence is what happens when argument becomes unnecessary. Bruce Lee didn't prove that day that his techniques worked in combat. He proved something deeper. That combat itself doesn't care where ideas come from, only whether they survive contact with reality. And in that bare training hall, stripped of ceremony and ego, reality spoke clearly, quickly, and without raising its voice.